Emily from Autofy. Wanted to show you guys how to create your own workflow. Autofy does have workflow templates already available for you with steps built out, but you may have a sync that's going to be outside a typical template. Really easy to do to create your own workflow is to click on this Make Your Own when you're on the Choose a Workflow page. What this will do is allow you to pick the connections that you want for this workflow. And today I'm going to create a workflow between Salesforce and QuickBooks Desktop. Once I've selected my connections, I'm going to go ahead and click Create Workflow. This brings us to a new page that's going to allow us to build out our steps. For this particular workflow that we're going to create today, I want to sync Salesforce quotes to QuickBooks estimates. So I need to select my first connection, which is my source, and I'm going to select Salesforce. Then I'm going to come in and I'm going to search for my quote object, and then I'm telling Autofy where we're going to insert this, and this is going to be inserted into QuickBooks as an estimate. Once you've selected your source and your destination, give the page just a second to update and refresh. Depending on the objects that you're syncing, there may or may not be default mapping involved. When I click on the mapper, I can see for this particular object to object, so our Salesforce quote to estimate object, there really isn't any sort of default mapping. And that's okay because we can go in and add additional fields. But we're going to cover that in just a minute. Another step that I want to add to my workflow is I want to sync QuickBooks invoices to Salesforce opportunities. So I'm going to go ahead and set up my steps, and I'll go back and adjust mapping later. So I select QuickBooks as my source, and then Salesforce as my destination. It's very simple to create steps automatically. And we're going to do one more step here. And this is going to be to where I want to sync Salesforce products into QuickBooks as items. So I've got my 3 steps in my workflow set up just from the very beginning. And now what I want to do is I want to go into the mapper for each of these to make sure that I have all the fields mapped that I need mapped. Now you'll notice on the invoice to opportunity step, there is default mapping. So this is a sync that happens often. So we are able to see what fields in QuickBooks would typically need to sync over to our Salesforce opportunities. And same with products and items. Now our quote to estimate sync doesn't really have any default mapping. As you can see, there's nothing that's really matching up between these 2 objects. Now it doesn't mean that it can't work, because it can. We just need to go in and add in our mapping manually. Really simple process to do. I personally like to start with a clean slate, so I'm just going to go ahead and delete this one mapping for the customer name because there is nothing mapped to it on the Salesforce side. One of the first things you always want to make sure that you are mapping are IDs. This is something that Autofy uses to handle record matching behind the scenes for you. That way Autofy knows when to update a record, what update to record after it's already been synced. So what we're going to do on the quote side is we are going to look for an ID that says quote ID. And on the QuickBooks side of the mapper, we're going to map this to the external ID. So anytime you create a new step, you do want to make sure that you are syncing your object ID, so your source destination object ID, to your destination object ID. And just click Save. And now we have our first mapping, which will show up down below, and then we can continue to add. Some things that I want to do here. I want to make sure that the name of my quote syncs over as the name of my estimate. So I can map my quote name to my estimate name and click on Save. And any additional header items that I think are going to be important to sync from my Salesforce quote to my QuickBooks estimate, that's what I can add in at this point. So if there's any additional information that I want to map over, I can do so here. As you can see, there's a lot to choose from here on the Salesforce side. And you still have a lot to choose from here on the QuickBooks side. What's really important is the customer information. We need to know which customer this estimate's going to be associated to. So what I'm going to do is I need to look under the account ID lookup, and I am looking for the account name. On the customer side, I'm going to select the customer name and hit save. Now you will notice when you are choosing a field that has a longer maximum length from the source than the destination, it is going to give you a little warning. QuickBooks does have strict character limitations on their side. As a good rule of thumb, so you don't run into any string too long errors, is to make updates to your fields that you're utilizing in Salesforce to match those character counts. So that way you won't run into any errors. So I'm going to go ahead and click save. And now since the customer is under a tree, or it's under a lookup, you're going to see it under a tree right here. So anything that's going to be related to the customer on this particular estimate will fall under its own tree. If you want to update additional information on your quote to estimate step for your customer, you can do that as well. So if you wanted to update the billing information on the customer level, not necessarily for the quote or estimate itself, then you just want to make sure that you're still under this account ID lookup. So that way we're looking for the account related information. So I can go ahead and use my billing street. And under my customer, I can expand the billing address and say billing address 1 and click on save. And you can see it's going to fall under its own tree so that you know that the billing information that you're updating right now is specific to the customer and not necessarily the billing information on the estimate itself. So I can do my billing city, save that here. We're going to go ahead and just quickly add in states, zip code, those details. And I can do the same thing with shipping information. What's really important to keep in mind are what your requirements are on both the Salesforce side and the QuickBooks side. So on the QuickBooks side, anytime you are creating a new transaction, QuickBooks does require that if something is syncing over as a transaction, that you have to have at least one line item. This is where we need to start mapping our line item information. Since we're going to be pulling from our quote line items here on our quote object, on the Salesforce side, I'm going to come over here to quote line item. And then on the QuickBooks side, I'm going to come over to line items. Now with the line items, I'm going to make sure, first of all, that I am syncing over the item name. So under the quote line item, I need to go into the price book entry ID lookup. And I'm going to look for product name. And then on the QuickBooks side, I'm looking for the item and the name. And I click save. Another field that we're going to want to include, of course, is the price, the quantity. You may or may not want to include the description. I would recommend that you do so, but that is completely up to you. And you can see down here that we are mapping our line item information. So next, what I want to do is I am going to grab the line item description, and I'm going to map that to the line item description in QuickBooks. Now I can use a couple different things here in Salesforce, just depends on my business model. I can either utilize the list price for this particular item or the sales price. I'm going to take the sales price and I'm going to map that to the rate and click on Save. I also want to include the quantity of those line items. So we're going to map the quantities. Now we have our line item information all sorted out. So I'm going to go ahead and close up my quote line item tree here. Same with my line items. Any additional information that you want to map, you can do so. But at this point, I feel pretty good about the mapping that I've done. When I run a single record sync, it is going to tell me whether or not I'm missing some required information. So I'm going to go ahead and click cancel to close the mapper and then hit save at the very top of my screen. And that's how simple it is to create a step. In order to make sure that information is syncing over as I'm expecting it to, the next thing that we want to do is we want to single record sync this. I'm going to go into my quotes and I'm going to go into this particular quote here. Take this Salesforce ID and I'm going to run the single record sync. Now, I'm not going into a ton of detail regarding the single record sync because we do have videos that will walk you through that as well. But we just want to test to make sure that everything is syncing over as we expect. Now, on this particular step, this is telling us that this particular customer was not found in QuickBooks. And why that's happening is on our configuration tab, we have don't insert records if related data isn't found. That's called strict mode. So that means if we can't find the related data, which is the customer data, in QuickBooks, we're not going to sync over this record and it will error out. Now, if I want Autofy to create a new customer on this step, if it does not exist, then I can deselect this checkbox and hit save. And we can try our single record sync again. And when you click on this, of course, it's going to tell you where it is in the process. It pushed our customer, it found all of our items, and our sync was successful. And just to confirm this, I can pull up QuickBooks. I'm going to go to my customer list here. And here is my new estimate that just synced over. So when I click on this estimate, we've got our customer information, we have our items that synced over, I've got my date, I've got the name of my customer. I must not have any billing information related to this account in Salesforce. Pulled over all these different line items for me, and it's also using our custom estimate template that we asked for it to. So it pulls over all of this information for us. I can go back to the mapper. I can make additional adjustments. If I wanted to take a look at this particular account in Salesforce to see if I have any billing information, I can do that. So what we're going to do is we are going to pull up this particular account, go to our details in Salesforce, and we are going to note that we have 0 billing address information. So if you notice that information didn't come over as you were expecting it to, best thing to do is check to make sure that you actually have data there. So I can very easily go in, edit this customer, put in my billing information, and hit save. Now if I want to redo this, resync this to confirm everything's coming over as expected, I have the option to do that from the single record sync, or I can also go to the status center make sure that I go to the correct workflow and reprocess that record from here. Great. So it said that it pushed over, it updated, and now you can see here is my address information. So always a good rule of thumb, double check to make sure that there actually is data that should be pulling over. If it's blank, you're not expecting it to be blank, just always double check the source first. And that's how simple it is to create a brand new step on your workflow. Now that we've created a step and set up our mapper, let's talk about the configuration tab. So this configuration tab is telling you what's going on with your sync. What information are we pulling? Are we filtering it out? Do we have any specific preferences, and where is it going? So we're looking for quotes from Salesforce that have been created or modified since this particular date. This date right here is your last successful sync time. So Autofy looks for records that have been created or modified since this specific date. You do have the ability to click on this date and set it back 2 weeks. You can't go further than that because Autofy does not support historical transactional syncing, but you can push this date back. You can push it forward as well. So maybe if I want to make sure that I'm picking up some records from the 11th that I may have created, then I can set my date and my time. Now, before you hit the save button up at the top, you can click undo so that it does not save this time frame. Next thing we have is the when. The when is telling us when we're actually going to sync records. So first, we're looking at all records that were created or modified since this particular date, but maybe I don't want quotes to sync that are in a specific status. So if I go to my list of quotes, maybe I only want quotes that are in the accepted status. What I can do here is I can set my filter to the status field. When this equals accepted. So this means that any other quote, if I try to sync it and it's not in the accepted status, then it is not going to sync. And I can add additional filters if needed. This preference right here that says don't insert records if related data isn't found, that's what we call strict mode. As you saw a little bit earlier, our record did not sync because we had this turned on. It did not find the customer in QuickBooks, so it did not sync this record. It failed because the customer did not exist. And then here we can see that we are inserting these quotes that have been created or modified since this date. When they have this particular status, we're going to insert them into QuickBooks as estimates. Anytime you make an adjustment here, make sure you click Save at the top of the page. And just a little pointer, even if you're down on step 10, you don't have to scroll up to the top. This bar right here stays put, so you don't have to scroll all the way up to the top and lose your place. The Tasks tab, this tab right here shows you what's going on with your sync. Similar to the Configuration tab where you're setting up how your sync's going to work, the Tasks tab is showing you what it's going to be doing. And this is a read-only view, so it's showing us that we're selecting quotes from Salesforce where the last modified time is greater than this particular date, and when the status equals accepted. So what's going to happen is it's going to look for the customer in QuickBooks. If it finds it, it updates it. If it doesn't find it, it inserts a brand new customer. And then when it comes to the line items, if we find the items in QuickBooks, then those line items will be inserted on the estimate. However, if we don't find an item in QuickBooks, we don't insert items on a transaction sync. So what will happen is the sync will fail. This particular record will fail because the item was not found in QuickBooks. And then last, this is when the estimate gets pushed over to QuickBooks. If we find an already existing estimate with the same name or number, we're going to update that. If we don't find that estimate, then we're going to insert a brand new one. The mapper, of course, is where we spent some time earlier, adding brand new fields, updating our mapping, editing, deleting, and you, of course, can come in to these fields that have been mapped and you can edit them, you can delete them from the mapper. One cool feature that we have here is the sample feature. So if you want to see what information is going to be pulled before you actually do a sync, you can use the sample. And you're going to need that Salesforce ID to look at the sample. So let's go pull the Salesforce ID from the URL of our specific record. And we are going to paste that into the sample field. Now we're going to give it just a moment because it's pulling in all that information. You can see here the details that it's pulling over. We've got our account name, we've got all those details right here. So that way we can see the information that it will be pulling over. Just a good way to see what's going to be there before we run a single record sync. In the preview tab, this is meant to pull just a small bit of information from Salesforce to show you what particular records in Salesforce will fall in line with what's going to sync over. Now right here, we have 2 records that have been modified since this particular date. That's all that it's going to show us, are only records that have been modified or created since that specific date. I do have the ability to sync both of these records from here if I want to. I can just select one. Now, if you are going to be running a sync or running tests, you only want a specific step to run in your sync and it's not this one, you can always turn that off. When you turn steps off or on, make sure that you click the save button up at the top of the page so that way we can save those settings. You can also delete steps from your workflow if you no longer need them. They will disappear from your workflow, but you have the option to turn all of these steps on or off as needed. On our workflow here, we have 3 separate steps. We have our Salesforce quote to estimate step. We have our QuickBooks invoice to opportunity step. And we have a Salesforce product to item step. Something important that I want to point out with our Salesforce product to item step is that you can absolutely do this. One thing though to keep in mind is what are the required fields when you're creating a new product in Salesforce and when you're creating a new item in QuickBooks. QuickBooks does require that you have an income account when you are creating a brand new item. So what I mean by that, let's go into my item list here. And when I go to create a brand new item, there is this field down here called account, and that is your income account. And this is a requirement from QuickBooks. So if you try to sync any products from Salesforce into QuickBooks, QuickBooks will require that you have an income account listed. Otherwise, you will get an error. And I'm going to show you exactly what I mean here. I'm going to go back into Salesforce and we're going to go to our products. I'm going to create a brand new product, very minimal information. We'll say that these are blue 12-inch spruce tree. Now this is all that I am going to do. I'm not going to fill in any other information for my product, and I'm going to hit save. So these are all the details that I have. I want to sync this item over to QuickBooks before I adjust any mapping. What's going to happen is this is going to fail because I don't have some information on my mapper that is required by QuickBooks in order to create this new item. So when I go to single record sync this, I am expecting it to fail, which is fine. And actually, this record filtered out before we could even do anything with it. Our messaging over here is telling us that this does not exist in QuickBooks. What that means, and we go back to this configuration tab, is that we have only update records turned on. When that's turned on, that means that this record is going to get filtered out. If it does not exist in QuickBooks, it's going to get filtered out because we only want to update existing. Easy enough. I can remove that checkbox, make sure I hit save, and then we can try our single record sync again. This time it will not get filtered out, but it will fail. And right here it's telling us that there's an invalid reference to a blank QuickBooks account in the item non-inventory. So what that means is we need to assign an income account. You may have items that always go into one specific income account. If that's the case, that's great. You can do a static mapping. That's probably not the case for many of you. So what you'll want to do in Salesforce is create a field on that product object to account for the income account in QuickBooks. Once you've done that, you're definitely going to want to make sure that you have the exact list that you have in QuickBooks, that it matches character for character. Otherwise, it's still going to fail because it's not going to find that specific income account. We also want to mark this as active, so that way it syncs over to QuickBooks as an active item instead of as an inactive item. And now that I've made that update and I have assigned an income account, I can sync this over. I do want to make sure though, before I do that, that I add this in as a mapped field. So on my Salesforce side, I'm going to select my QuickBooks income account. And then over on the QuickBooks side, my full name under income account. If all of your items will fall under the same income account, then there's really no need for you to create that new field in Salesforce. You can actually make this a static mapping. So a static mapping is going to take whatever string you put in and assign that. So when I say static value, if I say that this is cost of goods sold, every single time a product syncs over to QuickBooks as an item, the value for the income account will always be set to cost of goods sold. Just something to keep in mind. Makes it a little bit easier. So now we're going to do our single record sync again. And unless I missed another required field of mine in QuickBooks, this particular product from Salesforce should sync over to QuickBooks successfully. Perfect. Green dot means that it did sync over. So if I come into my item list, we can see that it's highlighted right here. Now I can go in and map additional fields, completely up to me if I want to do that, bring over any additional information. Whenever you are working with a brand new workflow, whether you've utilized the workflow templates that are available to you or you're creating your own, before you run a full sync, you do want to make sure that you've gone through and you've tested every single one of these steps several times with your single record sync to make sure that you have all the fields map that you want, because keep in mind, we can't unsync data. Once it's there, we can't undo. There's no undo button. So you do want to make sure that you're single record syncing every single step several times before you run a full sync. Another thing to point out when you are creating steps is that Autofy works with one-to-one relationships. So what that means is that we cannot sync a QuickBooks invoice to a Salesforce opportunity and then have another step that's syncing a QuickBooks invoice to a Salesforce quote or anything like that. It's a one-to-one relationship. So we can sync a QuickBooks invoice to an opportunity, or you can sync an invoice to a different object in Salesforce. But you can't sync one QuickBooks object to multiple Salesforce objects. And the same rule applies to fields. Fields are a one-to-one relationship. So we can sync a product name to the full name of the item in QuickBooks, but we can't sync the product name to the item full name and another field in QuickBooks. It's a one-to-one relationship. Good way to think about Autofy is that it's just taking data. Very simply, it's taking data from one place, so your source object, and it's sending it over to your destination object. We're not manipulating the data in between. We're taking it from point A to point B. Now, if you'd like, you can turn steps on and off within your workflow. Something else that you can do is set up notifications and your sync scheduler. So you can enable your sync scheduler from the settings tab for each individual workflow. Now keep in mind that you can only have one sync running at a time. So if you have multiple workflows set up, you will want to stagger those. So I can have this particular workflow sync every 2 hours from 3 a.m. till 6 p.m. every single day or weekday. And if I want to be notified while my scheduled sync is running, if we run into errors, I can set this up to where I get email notifications each time there's an error on my sync. We're not going to send you an email if it was successful, so no news is good news. But you can set that up for each individual workflow. And over here, depending on your subscription level, you can see I have several different workflows. They have different names. I might want to rename this workflow that I've created here today, and I can do that by going over to Workflows. I click this little edit icon here to the right, and I can rename this. And I can say that this is my quote to estimate, and then maybe my invoice to opportunity. So whatever I want to rename this, I can do that right here and click Save. And you can see it automatically changed right here. So for those of you that do have a couple different workflows, and maybe you started out utilizing the templates to make it really easy on yourselves and other users that might be logging in, is to go in and edit the names of your workflows. You can also include a description. I'm going to say in the sync, we are syncing Salesforce quotes to QuickBooks estimates, also syncing QuickBooks invoices to Salesforce opportunities, and you can just include additional details. You can also disable workflows from here. So maybe I'm no longer using this particular sync, so I can disable it. I don't want this one either. And that way I can clean up my workflow list over here without actually deleting anything. If I want to, I can always reactivate those. I can go down here to the inactive workflow section, and I can re-enable my workflows. So one last thing that we want to do is we want to run a full sync on this workflow that we've created today. My dates are pretty good. They're not set too far back. We may not even have some information that gets picked up. So we're going to go ahead and hit sync and let this run. And of course, you can always watch what's going on with each individual record if you want to see the tasks that are running, what's going on. As we can see, both my estimates synced successfully over to QuickBooks. It's finding the items, it was finding the customers, it was able to push the Salesforce quotes over to our QuickBooks as estimates. And then keep in mind, in between each step, validate our connections to QuickBooks and Salesforce. And in this particular sync, I have not created any invoice records in the last day or two, which is why there were no eligible records ready to sync. And on our final step, it's going through and it is validating our connections again. And then it's also creating new items for us. Our sync was successful. If I wanted to go take a look to see what didn't sync, maybe what did sync, what filtered out, I can always do that in Status Center by filtering to the correct workflow, and I can see the history of my items. If you guys have questions, please reach out to us at support@getautofy.com. Also, make sure that you hit that subscribe button down below so you'll be notified of any new videos that come available.